Hello, good evening. Gosh, what terribly well-behaved silence there. That obviously works. So thank you very much for coming. My name is Adam Joynson. I'm a professor here in the School of Management at the University of Bath. And tonight I'm going to be talking about the dark side of persuasion. Just to also let you know, it's being streamed live, so if you have any questions, I guess avoid swearing and be aware that there'll be people off in the distance listening in some form or other. So, and hopefully this works, my attempt at technological remote control. We shall see. Yay. Okay, so before I start, I'd like to do a few acknowledgements of people who have worked with me on some of the things that I'm going to be talking about, and also some of the people who've funded the research. So Emma, Joe, and Lukasz. Lukasz is a lecturer here in data science and was my postdoc researcher. Joe works on the CREST program with me as a researcher, and Emma was a researcher and is now at the University of Bristol as a Vice-Chancellor's Fellow. And they've all worked on various programs with me that have been funded by various people, including CPNI, the Centre for the Protection of the National Infrastructure. These are the people who do everything from testing bollards against trucks to protective security of organisations, especially in the critical national infrastructure, so energy, finance, and so on. EPSRC, ESRC, which are the UK's research councils that deal with social science and STEM subjects, and CREST, which I'm a lead of, which is the Centre for Research and Evidence on Security Threats, which is funded by the three UK intelligence agencies, MI5, MI6 and GCHQ, to look at how we can use human behavioural and, to a degree, management sciences to increase the security of the UK. And I lead the online behaviour strand, which looks at things like cybersecurity and how to get people to behave in a more secure way. So, obviously, influence, persuasion, the use of the internet and technology has been in the news a lot. You can't help but have noticed some of the things about Cambridge Analytica and the use of Facebook data to target people with almost kind of micro-precision when it comes to election campaigns, and indeed potentially for the Leave EU campaign to at least have investigated using Cambridge Analytica, although not necessarily to have used them according to their testimony today. We see other uses of persuasion technologies across kind of current events. So the Parkland shooting in Florida was almost immediately followed by a large number of automated bots pushing pro-gun messages across America. So this wasn't the NRA, this was actually traced back to the Russian Internet Research Agency in St. Petersburg, who were also, incidentally, the people who ran the bots that pushed lots of pro-Brexit messages just before the referendum. So if you remember, if you watched BBC News and you were in the UK at the time, there was a hashtag use a pen. That came directly from these bots that were being controlled out of St. Petersburg and were persuading people to take a pen into the polling booth because they were concerned that their vote would be changed to remain rather than to leave. And this was, apart from being completely fake news, was also purely kind of generated by the use of automated systems to persuade people. We also see the use of fake news. The most shared news content on Facebook was fake news in the US election. So Pope Francis giving his agreement or support to Donald Trump was the most shared story on Facebook pre-Donald Trump's election, followed by news stories about Hillary Clinton arming ISIS, all of which were completely fake. And in fact, there was more engagement with fake news on Facebook than there was with genuine news on Facebook. So people are being persuaded in all kinds of interesting and different ways using technology. We also have concerns, and we see concerns about technology itself. So these things that we all have and use all the time to kind of stroke away, and the use of smartphones as almost kind of addictive technologies that we've been persuaded to use almost kind of compulsively in terms of the way that they're designed. And it's no surprise that Apple, with its launch of iOS about 2 weeks ago, and Google, with its latest version of Android, are providing technologies that allow people to monitor their smartphone use. And so we have all these concerns about how people have developed tools that perhaps are damaging society or damaging individuals. And at the same time, we have all kinds of issues with cybersecurity. So a report that came out last week showed that there'd been a 350% increase in ransomware attacks. So, for example, the WannaCry attack against the NHS, where critical systems within the NHS were locked and the data was encrypted until organisations paid a ransom. And in fact, large proportions of organisations say that they'd rather pay the ransom than invest in cybersecurity, which is maybe something that they should start to consider and discuss about. But again, most of the attack vectors for these kinds of cybersecurity breaches are via email in some form or other. And what I'm going to talk about a bit later is how you can craft, or how these emails are crafted in order to persuade people to click on them and, in doing so, compromise the security of their organisation. And so underpinning all of these different technologies is persuasion. Persuading people to click on a link, persuading people to use a phone, persuading people via notifications to access LinkedIn or to access Twitter or anything else. Persuasion is what underpins all of it. Now, according to traditional models of persuasion, we think about often, first of all, the message. So in the 1950s, there was what's called the Yale approach to persuasion, which says we should think about the message, the messenger, and the recipient. So if we think about persuasive messaging, we think about someone trying to pitch something in terms of how you persuade someone. And so they did a whole series of studies which showed things like we're more likely to be persuaded by experts, for example, or we're more likely to be persuaded when we can listen to the message, when we've not got lots of distractions going around. We're more likely to be persuaded if we don't think the person who's trying to persuade us has an ulterior motive. For example, if they're talking against their own interests. What they started to notice was some interesting interactions between these things. So, for example, experts had a really big impact if people were distracted. And so this led to what's called the dual process. You might have come across Daniel Kahneman's kind of thinking fast, thinking slow, the idea of system one, system two. And what this says is that we have two routes to being persuaded. We have one which is cognitively intense, where we have to really focus on a message and we have to work through that message. And this is called the central route or systematic processing. So that's when you're really evaluating the pros and cons, you're thinking about the evidence and everything else. The other is what's called heuristic or peripheral. And this is when we're distracted. We tend to be cognitive misers. We don't like using our brains up all the time because, otherwise we'd just be exhausted and not able to do anything else. And so we rely on cues. And some of these cues are things like, oh, the person seemed to know what they're talking about. They were an expert. Oh, it's made me feel this kind of emotion. And that's actually how we're persuaded most of the time, not because we process all of the arguments in a very systematic way, but rather because we're relying on rules of thumb. And this has developed a little bit more through a US researcher called Robert Cialdini, who's talked about weapons of influence in persuasion. And he says that there's 6 weapons of influence that you can use in order to persuade someone. The first is reciprocity. And this is the idea that if I do something for you, you do something back for me. And there's been lots of studies to suggest that if you buy someone a Coke or a coffee, then they're likely to do you a favour back at some point. Charities use this by giving pens when they, or market research companies by giving pens when they send out questionnaires or donation requests. Exactly the same kind of principle that they've given something to you and therefore you're much more likely to give something back. Happens in negotiation with and I'm wary of talking about my son after the last time I did it ended up in the Daily Mail, but I'll try doing it really gently, which is to say he's very good at negotiations where he will pitch high and then come back down to a lower level. And that is based on reciprocity, where he could say, oh, could I have £20? And I'll say, no. And then he'll say, okay, can I have 10? And I'll say, well, all right then. I'm a bit soft like that. And the reason it works is because he has effectively backed down from his request, and therefore I feel the need to reciprocate and go back. And so that's how you can use reciprocation in basic negotiations. There's other techniques, herding, which is that we look to others for guidance. We look to social norms, and that's why in hotels, it works just as well for a hotel to tell you that 70% of people use their towel more than once than it does to say you should use your towel more than once to save the environment, because we're guided by what other people do much of the time. We're more easily persuaded by people we like. This is why Tupperware parties work, because it's difficult to say no to someone who's a friend. So it's very difficult to kind of refuse to purchase off someone you like. Authority, we're much more easily persuaded by someone in a position of authority. Scarcity, we know, and you see in your everyday life that as something becomes scarce, it becomes more appealing. That's why Booking.com and all the other sites tell you there's only one room left and it's about to run out, because when something's scarce, it's seen as more attractive by the consumer. And finally, commitment and consistency. According to Cialdini, if you can get someone to make a public commitment towards doing something, you are 90% of the way towards getting them to actually behave that way. Because we want to appear consistent in terms of our public kind of commitments and our actions, but also we want to be internally consistent between our attitudes and our behaviour. So it makes us feel uncomfortable if we behave in ways that are inconsistent between the two. And so these are the traditional ways of thinking about how we persuade someone, and they're embedded in marketing programs and social psychology programs across the globe in terms of thinking about persuasion. What I'm really interested in is how can you persuade someone without a message? So how can you design in a way that actually gets someone to behave how you want them to without telling them? And this fits within the kind of general area of nudge or behavioural insights. So David Cameron launched the behavioural insights team, or the nudge unit, out of the Cabinet Office. It's now been partially spun off. And because most governments nowadays seem to be slightly kind of allergic to regulation and setting laws, they decided to try and get people to behave how they wanted to by effectively changing what's called the choice architecture, the way in which you structure choices for someone. And they've had two mnemonics for their approach. The first one is Mindspace, which I'll quickly go on, and more recently it's called East. And basically this is to say that if you want to design an architecture, a choice architecture for a group of people to behave in a certain way, you make it easy, which means effectively you make it the default easy route of action. So if you want someone to do something, why would you design it to be more difficult than the default choice? So as you walk around this campus, you'll see that in some of the new builds, there's pathways across beautifully laid lawns where people have walked, but there's no path laid. Because instead of looking to see what are called the desire lines of how someone wants to travel, instead they set up these beautiful kind of concentric patterns of paths, but that's not how people want to walk. They want to go as quickly as possible from point A to point B. And so you end up with these kind of little muddy paths between the two. And so make something as easy as possible. Make it the default. Make something opt out rather than opt in. So, if you want to get people to sign up to the organ donor register, make it that you have to opt out if you don't want to donate your organs on your death. Don't make it an opt-in. So make it as easy as possible. Don't ask for extra information. There's other things like make it attractive, provide rewards in some form or other, whether social rewards or feedback or anything else. Make it social in terms of exploiting social norms, the fact that we look to other people most of the time. And make it timely, and I'm going to come back to timely a bit more when we look at notifications. But basically, if you want someone to do something, ask them to do it or encourage them to do it at the appropriate moment. There's absolutely no point asking people to do something kind of, a week before they're likely to be able to engage in the appropriate behavior. So they also had this mind space approach which summarizes most of these things, which is think about the messenger, think about incentives, think about norms, defaults, think about salience, that we're drawn to what's novel and different in an environment, and think about how we can prime people in terms of how we're going to provide information. Think about the emotion that's contained within the content in some form or other. Think about getting people to commit or to pledge in some form or other. And think about ways that we can make people feel better. And there's other ways that we can think about changing behavior. So back before hotels had swipe cards with RFID chips to access hotel rooms, you used to have a physical key. Now, physical keys are a pain if you lose them, because if you're in a hotel, it's a security problem, and so you've probably got to change a lock. And if you've got to change a lock, you're looking at, upwards between 20 and 100 pounds, depending on whether you've got someone who can change a lock or not. So it's a pain if someone leaves a hotel without taking the key. And so that's why they used to have signs saying, please deposit your key behind the desk when you go out. And the problem was people wouldn't do that because we don't like the idea of just leaving our key sitting in a set of pigeonholes behind the reception of a hotel. And so the solution they came up with was to design the key fob in such a way that it was actually easier to leave the key at the hotel than it was to take it with you. And I'm sure if any of you have been to one of these hotels where you have the most ridiculous key fob, there's a reason. And the reason is so that you don't take it out of the hotel, because you would have ignored the instruction that's asking you nicely to not take your key with you. And so there's ways that we can think about combining the way we design products with the goals that we want to achieve when it comes to the actual product as well. And in my work, I'm interested in how we can use this to change people's behavior for the better. So how we can change people's environmental behavior, their travel mode choice. How can we get people to cycle more, for example? And actually, it turns out the way we can get people to cycle more is by making it both safer and faster. And it's got nothing to do with, pictures of happy families cycling like this. It's actually all to do with cycle paths and making the cycle paths as rapid as possible so it's faster than going by car. How can we get people to recycle more, for example? How can we get people to give up smoking? How can we get them to diet and eat appropriate foods and so on and so forth? And there's lots of technologies that have been used to try and achieve this. So when it comes to exercise, we can look at things like Fitbits or Nike Fuels or pedometers in some form, or apps that encourage you to compete and to track and monitor your progress towards a goal in some form or other. And so there's lots of evidence to suggest that we can use tools and technology to change people's behavior, and often we can use it to change people's behavior for the better. On the downside, we often see unintended consequences of some of these uses as well. So one of the technologies that we look at is Strava. And Strava, does anyone here use Strava in the room? Yeah, a couple of guilty-looking people who... So Strava is fantastic because it allows you to track all your running, and you can look at personal bests and things. But it also encourages you to, if you're a cyclist, compete for position in what are called King of the Mountains, which are specific segments that you can race all the other users on. And there's lots of cases where people have actually died trying to win back King of the Mountains, especially on descents, but in other situations, because it's such a compellingly persuasive device. If you're the leader and you get knocked off and you want to get back it, but people are taking risks in their everyday life that they wouldn't normally take. And so if we start to think about how we can use technology in order to persuade, one of the key researchers and thinkers in this field is someone called B.J. Fogg, who works out of Stanford in Silicon Valley, and he has influenced all kinds of technology firms out there in terms of how you can use technology and the design of technology to persuade people to behave in a certain way. And so it's partly his fault that we end up with many of the kind of slightly more compulsive technologies than perhaps we should. And he says that technology can be persuasive in three ways. The first is it can be persuasive by being immediate, by simulating, by allowing you to explore cause and effect relationships. So like a driving simulator, if I wanted to persuade you not to use your mobile phone and drive, I could put you in a driving simulator and I could get you to do something on your mobile phone and record things like reaction times and various things like that. And then I could get you to do the same thing without your mobile phone being used, and we could look at the difference, and that might persuade you not to use your phone while driving, for example. We can build all kinds of simulated environments where you can look at the kind of links between what you do and the effect. So that's one way we can use technology to persuade. We can use it as a social actor because we tend to respond to technology as if it were human in many ways. Anyone who's got really frustrated with a computer will know that they can arouse kind of human emotions. We're polite to computers. We don't want to offend them some of the times, and we also treat them as if they have some kind of intentionality. And so when we're rewarded by a computer, for example, if you have an app that says, well done, or, great, you've earned a badge, or you've earned a point, that has the same effect as a human giving us exactly that kind of feedback. So we can use it as a way of influencing people by giving the technology the ability to give us rewards and social interactions. And his main idea is that we can use technology to persuade by it being a tool. And it's a tool because it can do all kinds of things that we can't do, that makes life much easier. So it can do calculations. I wear a Fitbit, and this means I need to keep walking. And there's no way I could count the number of steps I do every day. It would be almost impossible. And yet this small piece of technology allows me to do it and persuades me at the same time because it lets me know when I've kind of hit a certain goal that I'm trying to achieve or not. I can do calculations in Excel that I just could not do or would take forever. I can remember stuff that, shopping lists that I just couldn't do. It makes stuff easier. I can order stuff off Amazon that comes the next day that I would have to go to another town to go and purchase. All of these are actually persuading me in their own way. Every time you decide to use Amazon because it already has your email, your postal address, or it has your credit card, it's being persuasive, and you're being persuaded because it's been designed to do that. So lots of ways that tools can persuade. And what Fogg talks about is 7 different ways that you can design technologies to be more compelling and to persuade people to behave in certain ways. And I'm not going to go into all of them in great detail because most are quite simple. So self-monitoring. We can persuade people by giving them the ability to monitor how they're getting towards a goal, which is why Fitbits and all these kinds of things work quite so well, and why in the workplace we allow people to track their progress towards sales targets or anything else because it's motivational. Reduction makes something simple. Amazon one-click purchasing is a perfect example of how technology reduces. It makes something simple. Imagine when you have to instead enter all of your details. That's a pain. So that's why it's persuasive, because it's more persuasive to go to their site versus one where you have to enter all of your details other times. Conditioning. We are very influenced by reward and punishment, and especially by reward patterns, and especially by intermittent reward patterns. What that means is that it's a reward pattern that doesn't pay out, say, every 5 goes or every 10 goes, but could be after 2 goes, and then after 12 goes, and then after another 5 goes, and something like that. If you think about the way that social media gives you reward and feedback, for example, by people liking your posts or sharing or commenting or anything like this, these are operating on a intermittent reward. And that's why it's quite so compelling, because you don't know if you're posting or if something you do is going to hit kind of, payload in terms of engagement from other people. Tunneling technology, where you blank out all of the other options and you're effectively taken through a series of steps. So the most obvious example is when you go to a new store, online store, and you have to register and you have to check out. You know, virtually no online stores give you the choice to kind of go upwards and downwards. Instead, you're given a very clear path through the store of enter your address, enter your credit card details, confirm, and complete purchase, and then back. You know, there's not the movement sideways back to the store. And we see all of these techniques to persuade built into most technologies that we use nowadays. And it's a very kind of clear line between the academic research into what makes something compelling and what can persuade people through design into the way in which the technology is designed and the way in which it's then used by the end user. The other thing that I just wanted to draw attention to is one of the key things that people in the persuasive design field talk about is what's called kairos, or the opportune moment. And this is really important for thinking about how we can use technology to persuade, which is that you don't want to try and persuade people to do something off in the distance or in the past. Instead, you want to try and embed your persuasive technology at the moment when they can make a decision to change their behavior. So the little kind of speed things that pick up your speed and give you a smiley face if you slow down, or if you're going at the right speed in the first place, of course, are a perfect example of 2 things. One is kairos, which is you can actually deal with your behavior at that moment. So what's the point of being told 5 minutes down the road that you were speeding? You know, you can't change your behavior. We actually want that stretch of road to be safer. So we want people to slow down as they're driving it. We don't necessarily want to punish them afterwards. And so it gives you the opportunity to immediately act on your behavior. The other thing it does is sorry, my phone is buzzing. I'm just going to switch it off. Ooh, there we go. The other thing it does is it gives you feedback if it gives you a little kind of smiley face. So it gives you a reward and it gives you the opportunity to behave at the right time. We get exactly the same. My Fitbit tells me when at 10 to the hour that I've not done enough steps if I've been sitting down. Apple Watch does exactly the same. All these kinds of technologies. And so what they argue is that what you've got to build in are triggers to behavior. And the type of trigger you want depends on how motivated people are to engage in the behavior and their ability to actually undertake the behavior. And so if you imagine you're highly motivated and it's very easy to do. This is what Fogg would call a signal, because we don't need to persuade you. All we've got to do is actually say, okay, it's time to do this now. Right? So that might be a different type of notification on a phone than, say, a spark, where it's very easy to do, but you're not that motivated, which in my case is usually things like LinkedIn notifications, right? Where I'm actually, it's dead easy to do, but most of the time I'm actually not that motivated to have a look that, it's someone's work anniversary. So in that case, they try and kind of tempt you in, because what they're trying to do is persuade you, to motivate you, rather than just say, okay, it's time to do this now. And so the language might be slightly different. And in fact, LinkedIn have a tendency to send people emails which have fake little notification red markers on. They've been caught out for it and have stopped doing it. But in the past, they would send you an email saying something like, oh, it's time to update, or someone's posted job things. And in their pretend LinkedIn, they would have a little kind of light saying that you had notifications even if you didn't. They don't do it anymore, but they have done. A facilitator is something where we need to make it easier for someone. So they're motivated, but it's difficult. And so we need to think about the types of triggers that take that into account. And so that's how we can design technology to persuade. And what people have started talking about more recently are what are called dark patterns in the use of technology to persuade. So most of the people who've talked about design and persuasion have talked about it being kind of benign paternalism. That we need to be conscious that if we're going to influence people's behaviour and design their behaviour, we need to be doing it for the best interests of themselves or for society. Dark patterns are attempts to influence people that actually go against their best interests in some form or other. And you see them, once you kind of know what to look for, you see them all the time. The most obvious is through defaults. So this is an infographic of what Facebook makes public by default. From in the top left corner in 2005, where most of the information was actually not public by default. It was kind of within your network by default, which often was a university. Through to 2010, when they made this visualization, and it's actually got worse since then, when large amounts of information was by default publicly available on the web. And so defaults is the most obvious. Uber uses dark patterns to encourage its drivers to keep driving even when they've signed off. And so what they will do is they will send a message when someone's trying to sign off, saying, in this case, you're $6 away from making $40 in net earnings. So what they will do is set an arbitrary target that the person had never set. This person hadn't said, oh, I want to earn $40 today in net earnings. But instead they set an arbitrary, approachable, kind of easy to get target when someone's trying to sign off, in order to try and get them back on, keep driving, everything else. When Uber launched in a new city, they would have ghost cars circling around, so it looked as if there were lots of cars, so that when someone installs the app, you think, oh God, there's loads of these cars. It's only when you start to use it in somewhere like Bath that you realise it's basically, one or two guys who've come over from Bristol because they can earn, 4 times surges most evenings at the weekend. So, they use all of these dark patterns to encourage people, to behave when perhaps they shouldn't be doing it. And lots of these things rely on human vulnerabilities. We are not perfect decision makers, and we have all kinds of vulnerabilities when it comes to understanding and interpreting the world. And I'm going to try this, and it's slightly risky, and if people are listening to the audio stream, this really isn't going to work. Okay? I'm going to try a magic trick via PowerPoint or Keynote. Okay. This is my best magic face. And what I want you to do is choose a card. Really focus on the card that you have chosen. Okay? So choose a card, repeat it over in your mind, start concentrating. Almost like what I want you to do now is almost imagine that card there. Right? Has everyone got a card? Okay. Right. So what I'm going to do now is I'm going to tell you what your card was. Okay? Right. Hang on. Yeah, I've definitely got it. Okay. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to make your card go. Is it gone? It's gone. Okay. So there you go. Magic via PowerPoint. So I'm guessing, anyone know how that's done? They're all different cards, which most of the time, you're all too smart, you see. Most of the time, we don't notice things. We have all kinds of change blindness when it comes to what's going on in the world around us, which is why, I run multiple test Facebook accounts. This is one of mine, Andy. And what you see is, this is an email. You can see Andy doesn't log on very often. I think number of notifications peaks at 99 because it would get embarrassing if you'd not been to see more. This is sent by email with no option to I don't really care. I've got go to Facebook or view notifications. They want me to view notifications because it's in the dark blue. This is their design language, right? Is the OK button is usually on the right-hand side and is usually in dark blue. And we're going to come back to this. Almost everything, every email you get, and if you've had the joy of all of the GDPR emails, you will know that your unsubscribe is often in a much lighter font, much smaller, and much more likely to be ignored in some form or other. Okay? So basic use of design to persuade someone not to unsubscribe from emails. So I decided to set up a pretend Facebook account for tonight's talk, just to show you how you can be nudged through different techniques to behave in certain ways. So this is Sue setting up her Facebook account. A useful trick for you, if any of you have Gmail, if you want to set up multiple and you don't want to use a disposable email address, if you add plus and then the name of the service you're using, then it will go to your Gmail account, but then it means that you can filter any emails that come from that. So if you're using online shopping and you want to find out who's doing stuff to your email, then all you do is, so my email is joinson@gmail.com, and I add plus this, and that means that it just goes through and I can filter it if need be, but it still comes through too. So interestingly, what this means is that I don't actually want Facebook to have access to my main account. This is why I've used it, and you'll see how difficult they make it for me not to do this. So I sign up, and they send me an email telling me to confirm the account. This comes through to my Gmail, and when I say confirm your email address, if you look at the choices, I've got connect to Gmail or update contact information. But if I click connect to Gmail, it wants me to log on via my real Gmail account so that they can get the full address without the plus bit. And if I go update contact info, it just takes me to change the email address and resend the notification. And it took me about 4 or 5 minutes to work out that I could escape this endless loop of kind of connect, I don't want to connect, change, I don't want to change, back through, by hitting the Facebook button at the top. You can see it's all greyed out, hitting the Facebook button multiple times until finally it got me out of this kind of loop of connect your email and give us all of your addresses and so on and so forth, which I managed to get to. And then you'll see right up at the top, confirm now, resend email, enter code. And so I finally managed to enter the code to verify the email was correct, even though it was a kind of created email. And then, this is what's called the kind of tunneling. All my choices are got rid of. Everything blacks out apart from that option, but that's fine. Look again that the OK is dark blue. Okay. And then it takes you through a series of steps. Classic kind of persuasion. Add all of these friends that you've never heard of or that you once knew. And if I connected it to Gmail, all of the people that you never liked at school or various other things. Because I haven't connected it to Gmail, it comes up with the most random selections imaginable for some odd reason. And then it takes me through uploading pictures and everything else. Again, trying to tell you, a bit like LinkedIn does with its percentage of your profile full. The privacy settings are set mostly by default to everyone being able to see everything and it being archived and searched. And if I want to deactivate the account, so this doesn't delete the account, but it deactivates, it's actually relatively straightforward. I go to the settings, deactivate. They still keep deactivate dark blue, but it's shifted, interestingly, to the left for some odd reason. But, it's still not that kind of, deceptive, and it's relatively straightforward because deactivating doesn't delete and is easy to get people back. If I want to delete my account, it adds a few steps. I have to enter my password, and we know most of the time people don't like entering passwords. That's like barrier number 1. I have to complete a captcha to say I'm not a robot. That's barrier number 2. But have a look at what's happened to the OK and cancel buttons. So cancel suddenly has become dark blue and on the right-hand side, and OK has become the grey and on the left. So this is an example of the kind of dark pattern use of design to encourage people to behave in a certain way, which in this case would be like, oh yeah, hit that one without thinking, because we actually are not very good at paying really close attention. If you want some homework, go onto Amazon and see if you can find out, without Googling it, how to delete your Amazon account. Just as an exercise, because it will take you an awful long time. And there's no danger of accidentally doing it, because you actually have to be involved in a phone call to do it. So don't worry, you're not going to accidentally delete it. But see if you can work out how to delete. Because, of course, they're making their money from your data as much as anything. So how can we start to think about how this all fits together? We can think about the intrusiveness of phones. This was this morning's Daily Telegraph, I believe, about the Children's Commissioner asking for curbs on children using social media and the algorithms that are used to make it so compulsive. We know that lots of people use their phones like excessive amounts of time. In fact, research by Lukasz, my ex-researcher, and colleagues, asked people to estimate how often they checked their phone, and the average was 40 times. They then put an app on people's phones, and most people checked their phones on average 85 times in a day. In a great study, people came into the lab and their phone was taken away from them while they did a task. The experimenter then rang their phone and they weren't allowed to answer it. Their heart rate jumped by 10 beats per minute. When it was given back to them, it fell by 13 beats per minute. So, we are so closely kind of intertwined with these things. We have this kind of generic fear of missing out, or FOMO, which is linked to all kinds of problematic use in terms of lower life satisfaction, kind of potentially kind of problematic addictive use of phones. At least 39% of people admit to using their phone in the bathroom. I knew I had to put this in. I did do a little kind of test, and one person said that they use it in the bathroom because it's the only place they get some peace and quiet to do some reading. But for most people, it's almost like a compulsive habit of kind of not being able to be with your own thoughts for much of the time. That you rarely see people who are just sitting observing the world around them. And there's been lots of studies to suggest that what they call mindless phone use, when you're just like killing time, you're waiting for someone, you're waiting at a bus stop or anything else, is linked to inattentiveness. And the more you use your phone, the more likely you are to be unable to delay gratification. So that means, that you expect more kind of instant gratification. So actually taking this into the bathroom in terms of for your own concentration and your own awareness of the outside world is not good. There's several reasons why. It's actually not that good. And this is really going to put you off, I hope, or it's going to make you get antibacterial cleaners, is that we can learn an awful lot by taking swabs from your kind of lovely screen. And we can learn things like, the type of soap you use, whether you use antibacterial soap or not. We can tell what you've eaten. We can tell certain things about your medical status. And we can obviously tell where you've been using your phone. And the reason we can tell where you've been using your phone is because the most common bacteria that's found on smartphone screens is at least partially fecal in origin. So if this doesn't make you think that you should clean your phone, if that's not, if there's one lesson from this masterclass, it should be, please clean your phone screen with at least a reasonable degree of regularity. The other work we do is phishing and scams and how dark persuasive patterns can be embedded within phishing and scams. And there's lots of evidence that attacks against SMEs and against large organizations are based on emails that are being sent. Around 70% of large organizations, charities and businesses have been attacked by email-based cyber breaches. The average cost of a cyber breach now is well over £1.2 million per breach. So lots of kind of issues. Snapchat, for example, were hacked a couple of years back where it looked as if it had come from a CEO of Snapchat asking for payroll information. So this was classic social engineering attack. And the PA admin obviously kind of, didn't want to offend the CEO and so sent all of the payroll information for the company to the attacker. Another kind of example of social engineering type attacks that use persuasive technologies is from a banking company where this is the other classic. If you're going to attack someone using this kind of approach, do it on a Friday just as they want to go home at the weekend. So they were attacked on a caller said that they were from Coots and said that there'd been fraudulent activity and needed to get codes to check suspicious payments. This person obviously just wanted to get home and by doing this, they ended up being defrauded by over £1 million. There's lots of evidence that scams and phishing attacks use exactly the same kind of persuasive techniques as we've already been talking about. So Frank Stajano from Cambridge University did a great study with Paul Wilson from The Real Hustle, looking at the techniques that scam artists use. And most of these are actually very similar to the persuasive techniques that I've already talked about. Distraction, social compliance to norms and authority, conformity, not giving people much time to respond, so not allowing them to really process and think about stuff, but actually rushing them through a decision, appealing to their motives that might be about greed or need for finance or anything else. And we see exactly the same when we start to analyse phishing emails. So these are the kinds of emails that get sent saying your bank account's been locked, or in the case of around the university, we got one which I'll show you saying that your library account has been cancelled, which was the least kind of compelling phishing email I've ever had. But and they always have the same kind of thing. They have a sense of urgency. Respond now. You're about to lose access to something or other. We've got an encrypted message if you don't respond now. Or it's a boss phoning saying, listen, I'm about to pitch and I desperately need this information. That's how Kevin Mitnick, famous US hacker, got the code for running the first Motorola phones by pretending that he was in a really important meeting, phoning up, and someone just sent them to him. So, sense of urgency. Emotions make people fearful. Most of the phishing emails do that. They say, oh, something terrible has happened. You've lost access to your money. Have lots of cues, images, authoritative cues. Use social influence processes in terms of reciprocity. This is more for long-term things. And fulfill people's expectations. If you want to phish someone who works in a purchase invoice department, then send them an email that is about purchasing or invoicing or anything else, not about something unrelated. And so the work that we've been doing has been looking at all sorts of things like the message within an email that persuades someone to click and give away their company's secrets, through to them as an individual, their likelihood of trusting, their level of education and so on, and the organisation. So the context, is it hierarchical? Is it undergoing merger? Is it, does it have very good cyber security hygiene and culture? Is a person accessing late at night on their phone versus sitting in the office? All of these kinds of factors. And really briefly, just to show you how some of these things might work, I'm going to try this one again. So, as you might have noticed when you came in, there's wine and nibbles outside, and I'm conscious that I'm starting to take up way too much time, so I'm going to have to speed up. There's wine and nibbles outside. And so, on your way out to the wine and nibbles, I give you two choices. The first is you have to give me £5. The second is I'll toss a coin, and if it's heads, then oh, no, this is a game. I give you £5 on the way out. Sorry, I'm not reading properly. So that's how keen we were for you to come. So you either go out and I definitely give you £5 before you hit the food, or I toss a coin. If it's heads, you get £10. Tails, you don't. So who would take the £5? Okay, so that's probably about 2/3. Who'd take the risk for the £10? Okay, so maybe about a third. Okay, so most of you went for the 5. So let's flip it and say, actually, you've gained so much from this, we're going to actually charge you. And you can either definitely lose £5, or you can take a gamble. And again, if it's heads, you give me £10. If it's tails, you give me nothing. Okay. So who would take the certain giving me £5? Hands up. So that's 3 of you, 4. And who would take the risk? That's like 90%. And so we tend to be a lot more risk averse when it comes to gains. Like most of you wanted to take the absolute £5, and we're a lot more risky when it comes to losses. Now think about phishing emails. Most of the time, there's a kind of uncertain gain and a kind of loss that's possible. And we see this across all sorts of security problems. So let's say you're working late in the office, it's about to shut, and you've got to pitch the next day. You're supposed to take your work out on an encrypted email, on an encrypted USB stick, but you've lent yours to someone. And so you've got 2 choices. They're locking up the office. You either break the rules and you do something like you email the work to yourself, and you think, well, I'll just delete it as soon as I've done it, and so it's kind of okay. This is something where the gain is certain, you'll get to do the work, and the loss is uncertain, because something might go wrong, but actually, what are the chances of someone, accessing your email, getting that important corporate data, but you'll definitely have the information to be able to pitch the next morning. And we know from the £5, £10 that this is more appealing than option 2. You just go, no, I'm going to stick to the rules, where we know your loss is certain because you're not going to be able to pitch properly, but the gain is uncertain because you might have gained some security, but perhaps not. And we see this with all of the emails. I'm going to have to speed up, I realise I've just been wittering. Look at all of the phishing emails. They have a loss that you want to avoid. They have time limits on it. They have an easy option for you to address this loss. They have politeness, which fits kind of social norms, and they have authority. We see this with the one that came around the university, the very ineffective, like your library thing. It's almost like saying, you know, you will not be able to come to any more committee meetings unless you enter this information. You know. Anyway, it does exactly the same. Dear staff, student, you know, it's going to be awful. You're not going to be able to log on. And, you know, exactly the same thing. We've been running studies where we've looked at phishing simulations. This is where organizations phish their own staff. So they send stuff out and they look to see who's clicking, and they try and use that as a baseline to see if they can improve their performance or not. So this was the results of 120,000 sent to 4 critical national infrastructure organisations in the UK, 2 in the financial sector, 1 in the defence sector and 1 in the government sector. Lots of variety. Some got 6% click rate. Some were getting 35%. This one's 32%, I think. Our top 36% of people, I think, clicked on a phishing email. And of that 36%, another third of those then entered their login details. So effectively, you're looking at a hit rate of 10% for the best phishing emails against, these are not, you know, little SMEs who have no, you know, these are people running large-scale kind of, you know, either defence contracts, government departments, or large, very well-known financial institutions. So, you know, everyone is vulnerable to these things. And we asked people, why did you click? Because in one of the studies, they went through to a questionnaire for us, and it won't surprise you that most people actually said, well, we're not kind of sure. It looked about right, and, you know, the IT department deals with this sort of thing. If it gets through to our very secure network, it doesn't really worry me. And it had stuff about World Cup tickets. So, you know, what harm could it do, type thing. Didn't matter what grade you were in. Yeah. So typically when we went and interviewed in these organisations, the people up at the top would say, oh, you know, it's not board level that's a problem, it's all the admin people, you know, who are, you know, clicking away randomly and they can never be trained. And all the admin people would say, no, we actually do the training, it's the people at the board who just click away. And actually, grade made no difference. There were some geographic differences, but actually it was the content of the message. If it was high authority and urgency, it didn't matter who you targeted, whether it was from the CEO down to the admin person at the front desk. That's what mattered, was a message and the techniques used to persuade. We also did experiments where we interrupted people. As you probably know, what it's like being interrupted when you're on a demanding task. It's quite annoying. So we gave people a really demanding task, and we had fake interruptions coming up that they had to either accept or cancel as they were doing this demanding task. And perhaps not surprisingly, when people were doing a really demanding task, during the task, which is the dark bars, people were much more likely to accept fake update messages and interruptions than when they weren't doing the demanding task. So if someone's really busy, they're more likely to fall for these kinds of things. So what can we learn from all of this? Number one is train people to watch out for and understand persuasion techniques. Which is doing this, other organisations that we've worked with are doing this, is actually the technology changes all the time. In terms of, you know, now we've got text message scams, we've got phone scams or anything else. Teach people to look out for stuff that looks too good to be true. Someone's pushing you for time to make a really quick decision, for example. You know, all these kinds of things. So train people to spot a negative, persuasive, dark persuasive attempt. Use the same techniques for good. This is the speed of travel in Copenhagen when you install what they call the green wave, which is when you synchronize all of the traffic lights for cyclists going through. So, the top is what happened when they didn't do it. You can see it stop, 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 start. Average speed 10.5 miles an hour. It took 10 minutes 54. This is when they had used technology as a green wave, and travel time drops to 9 minutes 30 and speed goes up to 12. So use technology to achieve the goals in a more pro-social way. Engineers need to stop treating technology as a tool. This is a quote from Andrew Bosworth from Facebook, talking about Facebook as a tool. Zuckerberg did exactly the same at Congress, where he said, maybe someone dies in a terrorist attack coordinated on our tools, and still we connect people. Anything that allows us to connect more people is often a de facto good. This assumption that you can design and it be neutral in some form or other, almost as if they were designing spades and just, it's not their fault, it's used to hit someone on the head or to plant something negative, completely ignores the fact that most of these people have been through training courses that teach you how to build something that is as compelling and leads people to behave in a very specific way. Of course, their business model is also based around these design cues. Think about ethics in terms of innovation. We tend not to think about innovation. We have this idea about fantastic disruptive innovation and technologies, and yet often we don't think about the ethical implications of the innovations and the disruptions that we're also using and engaged in. So this was in The Guardian on Monday this week. Killer robots will only exist if we're stupid enough to let them. Like, that's reassuring. We're not well known for stupidity. And so we need to think about things like responsible innovation, which is used by the research councils in the UK. There's a big push to actually think, well, okay, let's develop something, but let's think about how it's going to be used in the future. Let's try and be responsible when it comes to the disruptive innovations and the technologies that as entrepreneurs or as businesses or as engineers or anything else we're building to make sure that we know how it's going to be used. I may talk about using it to anticipate how it's going to be used, to reflect on what the impacts of that use might be, to engage stakeholders and designers and users in conversations about the disruptive innovations that we're using, and then to act upon it when it comes to the design. Thank you. Sorry.